Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Equality Speaker Series. As you can see, today we're going to feature Dr. Emerald Christopher-Byrd, whose presentation is titled Big D stands for Big Demeanor, the link between Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Kamala Harris, and Meg the Stallion. First, we want to take a bit of time to acknowledge our co-sponsors that made this event possible, and that would be the Center for Women and Gender Equity, the Dowdy Multicultural Center, the President's Commission on the Status of Women, and the Center for Civic Engagement and Social Impact. Just want to let you know that at the end of the presentation, we will have time for some questions. So please go ahead and use the Q&A feature to input your questions at any time. And then before we hear from Dr. Christopher-Byrd, here is some background about her. So she is an assistant professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware. She received her doctorate in language, literacy, and culture with specializations in African American women's history and gender studies. She is a past recipient of the Women's Research and Education Institute's Congressional Fellowship on Women in Public Policy. Dr. Christopher-Byrd's research focuses on the social-political position of Black women in the United States. Her forthcoming book, Unfit for Marriage, Black Womanhood and Relationship Advice Literature, examines the racially biased discourse around Black women's behavior and the perpetuation of patriarchal structures in contemporary relationship advice. Dr. Christopher-Byrd's current research examines the cultural politics of identity and their translation into public policy and interpersonal violence against women of color. Dr. Christopher-Byrd, we welcome you and thank you for engaging with us.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Again, I am Dr. Emerald Christopher-Byrd, and I am happy to be with you this afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me for this event. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on. No matter where we are right now, we are all on Indigenous land, the traditional land of our tribal brothers, sisters, and siblings, and I honor and respect with gratitude tribal elders, past and present, for their stewardship of this land and its people. And I thank them for allowing me to do my work and live on their land. I invite all of you who are present today to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us all into this space today. With that said, I'm going to share my screen with you all now. Please note that the slides are not all-inclusive, so I will be speaking through all of this. So today, my talk is focused on tying together Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Kamala Harris, and Meg the Stallion. My style is to contextualize contemporary issues or contemporary ideas with historic pieces. It all is connected in different ways, and that's what I'll be doing today. So we'll start by talking a little bit about Jane Crow and what that is, political violence that is associated with it, the concept of misogynoir, and then the contemporary manifestations with the three women that I mentioned earlier. I'll leave time at the end to answer any of your questions, so please feel free again to use the Q&A section. First, I'll start with Pauli Murray. Some of you may have heard of her before, some of you may have not. Pauli Murray was a scholar and activist, and she was one of the first women admitted into Howard University's law school. I pay much respect to her, and the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has also mentioned on numerous occasions the way in which she used Pauli Murray's concept of Jane Crow in order to address sex discrimination. And in 1947, she developed this concept based on her experiences of being both African-American and being a woman. Part of what she was arguing at this time in the late 1940s was that the civil rights movement, Black Power movements, all those movements focused on race failed to account for sexism within it. With that said, when going or looking at the women's movement to address sexism, the women's movement often didn't include ideas around race, sexuality, class, and other identities. So part of what she writes is that African-American women's experiences of being discriminated against is a result of both racism and sexism combined. And so within that framework, she talks about male supremacy as well as white supremacy. She says, quote, "The Negro woman finds herself at the bottom of the economic and social scale," end quote, both as being, again, Black and being a woman. And so Jane Crow, the concept itself, demonstrates the overlapping and interconnected forms of inequality. And part of this was part of Pauli Murray's contribution to the brief written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, addressing sex discrimination. And so how we bring all of that together. 1947, Pauli Murray develops Jane Crow, and then we have this concept of intersectionality that I know you all have heard about ad nauseum, and sometimes it's a buzzword, it's a concept that's used without depth. But Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the executive director of the African American Policy Forum, talks about intersectionality, coins the term in the late 1980s, and part of her concept of intersectionality incorporates Jane Crow. And so she talks about in this quote that I have up here, how Black women, brown bodies are routinely killed or tortured by or through police brutality, and yet we seldom hear the stories of those women. And so this is why the African American Policy Forum created the hashtag Say Her Name, not to discriminate against Black men or to say that we should not talk about Black men or other Latinx men who are killed by police, but rather we also need to talk about women who also feel this violence. Part of what she's saying in terms of intersectionality is if you want to solve racism in a country, if you want to solve racism in society, we can't think about 50% of the population. We have to talk about how police brutality impacts both men and women based on not only race, but based on gender as well. And so Black and brown bodies, specifically women's bodies, experience violence as well, and yet we seldom hear about it in public discourse. Of course, recently, that has shifted a little bit in the case of Breonna Taylor. I would argue that we are at a particular historical moment in which that Breonna Taylor's life and story is allowed to be put in the forefront. But prior to Breonna Taylor, there have been a number of women, African American as well as Latina, who have been raped, murdered, tortured in some way through police brutality. The only time, or the main times we see Black women and brown women's bodies in discourse around police brutality is when they are crying, protesting, coming involved in an uprising for the purposes of a Black or brown man that dies, and so, or that's murdered. And so what you see on the screen is a photo that was created by one of my former students that illustrates how Black and brown women are at the forefront of these protests and uprisings, and yet their stories are the ones that are seldom heard in the media. So racialized gendered borders, I call this, regulate Black and brown women's bodies. These things are rarely challenged, again, because women of color are told that basically they need to wait their turn, that we need to address racism, and therefore this whole sexist gender thing needs to be put to the side. And so part of this historical framework gives you an idea of where we are in terms of contemporary manifestations when we talk about the Jim Crow era and how the contemporary US justice system fails to acknowledge or fails to find justice for Black and brown women because of that dual issue of racism and sexism. And keep in mind, in the legal system, normally you have to fight for one or the other when you're talking about discrimination in a legal case. And so that brings us to this idea of misogynoir. This term was coined in 2010 by Moya Bailey, and part of what Moya Bailey was trying to articulate is that there is both misogyny within the wider community, but there is also specific misogyny within communities of color. And part of the reason why we squirm, or some people squirm and think about that, is because you already have this whole mainstream racism issue, right? So if there is a woman of color and a man of color and they're in a domestic dispute, oftentimes the woman is there having to make a split decision of whether or not she's going to contact the police for her safety, or having to worry about what the police might do to that individual, regardless of the domestic dispute that's at play. There is a catch-22 there, for lack of a better term, where women of color often fear the police presence in their communities, while simultaneously having to fear the men in their community. And so misogynoir brings up 4 stereotypes that is frequent around not only Black women, but Latinx women as well. You have the sassy Black woman, the woman that snaps her fingers, tosses her head, the angry Black woman, the strong Black woman, and then the over-sexually Black woman. All of these stereotypes have groundings in different cultures as well. For Latina women, it can also be the loud, obnoxious woman, the sassy and frivolous woman. And all these stereotypes have connections. They all are grounded differently historically, but misogynoir brings up this idea that not only do women of color have to face sexism within the wider community, as well as racism, but sexism within their own communities. And so that brings us to the women that we're talking about today. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, originally from the Bronx, though I do have a special affinity for her because I'm from the Bronx as well. But this past July, she was approached by another member of Congress on the stairs of Congress, and he essentially accused her for being crazy because she connected poverty and crime. She was talking about how the poverty within communities of color, in particular, her constituents, that crime can be associated or tied to poverty in some way. This particular representative, Ted Yoho from Florida, basically called her crazy. And as he was walking, or as she was walking away, he was overheard as saying or calling her, "You fucking bitch." A note about language, as you'll see on the screen. I'm going to use the language that people use. Language has power. Particular language was used intentionally against Representative Ocasio-Cortez to in different ways to intimidate her. And so her response on Twitter, as you'll see on the screen, essentially ends with, "Bitches get stuff done." In addition to addressing this issue on Twitter, she took to the House floor to talk about what happened. And part of what she said was that she didn't need an apology from Representative Yoho. Rather, she wanted to say that based on her legacy from her mother and father, based on how she was raised, she was taught that she shouldn't accept certain language or certain behavior from other people. And so on the House that day, on the House floor that day, the words patriarchy, toxic masculinity, feminism, and so many other terms were used. And I know you all might not necessarily sit and watch C-SPAN all day, but part of those speeches that Representative Ocasio-Cortez gave and the speeches that she yielded the floor to by other representatives matter, because part of what's happening at this time is addressing the political violence that women, especially women of color, face when they enter these spaces. And part of what it represents is when you push against power, when you push against people who own the power, they attempt to push back. And we see that playing out, and we saw that playing out in Representative Yoho's response or lack thereof to calling Representative Ocasio-Cortez a fucking bitch. I added this slide. This wasn't here before, but this recently came up on my Twitter feed regarding an opinion piece written in the Wall Street Journal. And part of it was talking about Senator Kamala Harris's dancing at a recent rally. And the words that were used to describe Senator Kamala Harris goes to the very core of those racial stereotypes that I talked about earlier, the sassy Black woman, the angry Black woman. And so part of it is highlighted on the screen. She was coming across as frivolous, that she just started dancing in the rain to Mary J. Blige's Work That. There's a reason why Peggy Noonan mentions Mary J. Blige. First of all, Mary J. Blige is a Black R&B singer. So the fact that you have Kamala Harris on stage, who is breaking barriers as one of the first African-American and South Asian candidates on a major political ticket, the disturbance of that, Peggy Noonan is addressing in this opinion piece, but part of what it reflects is our society's ongoing need to stereotype not only women, but women of color based on historical stereotypes of their behavior. And so protecting Black women, protecting Black and brown women, what this means. What you see on the screen is a quote from the Erasure of Black Girlhood's Childhood, which was a study conducted by Georgetown University. And part of what they argue is that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers. Black girls are perceived to be more independent, more knowledgeable about sex, and in need of less protection. And this doesn't only apply to Black or African-American, it also applies to Latinx women. And so Meg the Stallion recently performed on Saturday Night Live, and in the back, she had Protect Black Women up on the screen. Following that, she wrote a piece in the New York Times on October 13th, confused as to why the term Protect Black Women would be so controversial. And what she addresses is the being shot this year. So she was at a party. She was near a man who she says in this opinion piece was, she was not in a relationship with, and he shot her. And what she found most disturbing wasn't only being shot, but going back and seeing what people wrote on social media who questioned what happened at the time, questioning what she did that resulted in him shooting her, rather than why he shot her in the first place. And why would we ever question someone who was a victim of a violent act? And part of what she gets to in the core of her piece is saying that Black women, brown women, women of color have the right to wear whatever they want to wear. They have the right to address sexuality however they want to address sexuality without being faced with violence. And so when we look at the statistics, when we see the number of Latinx and Black women who are either discriminated against or faced with violence, we know that they are more at risk than their white peers. And so protecting Black women doesn't mean that we don't protect Black men. Protecting Black women doesn't mean that we don't protect other men of color, but rather it's acknowledging the combination or the interconnectedness of both racism and sexism. And so one of the cases that I want to talk to you about today is not just Meg the Stallion, but in 2018, a young woman by the name of Joyce Quay was beaten by her boyfriend because her boyfriend said that she would not submit. Her boyfriend was a former police officer with Temple University. He used his baton to beat Joyce. According to news reports of the incident, a friend of Wright assisted him in the ordeal and said that Wright, the boyfriend, was extremely controlling and became upset that Joyce was not submissive enough. And so together, he and Wright stripped Joyce naked, handcuffed her to a bench, and as Wright beat her, Robinson, his friend, contorted her body so that Wright could strike Joyce in multiple places. Captain James Clark stated that Wright felt like she would not submit to his authority, and this was his way of punishing her to try to break her. Wright was charged with murder, aggravated assault, unlawful restraint, conspiracy to commit murder, and abuse of a corpse. The abuse of a corpse charge comes as a result of Wright continuing to beat Joyce after she died. So in one case, in the cases that we heard about earlier, in terms of police brutality, we have Black and brown women who are murdered at the hands of police officers and the criminal justice system failing to give the victims justice. But in cases like Joyce, there's little attention paid to these victims in the public, both mainstream and in Black and brown communities. And in another light, when Black women are murdered, beaten, and tortured by Black men, the criminal justice system tends to act swiftly. And so Wright was immediately arrested. He was charged immediately. And the majority of men in these cases where we do hear about them or where it is reported, where Black and brown women call the police or other people call the police, we can see the quick justice that happens. And now we can question the criminal justice system, right? We can debate about how swiftly the justice system moves when it is a Black or brown man who is the perpetrator versus when it is a police officer that's the perpetrator. And so part of what Meg Thee Stallion is talking about in this opinion piece is addressing the need to protect women, Black and brown women, against violence, not only from the police, but within their communities as well. And so you have these three women who come together in different ways and talking about how you have women of color who are now major figures within the political frame. And so that tends to be a threat to white supremacy, that tends to be a threat to male supremacy. And we see all of these manifested in these three women. And so WAP, released by Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as an SNL skit featuring Maya Rudolph playing Senator Kamala Harris, have used different spins on WAP. So women against patriarchy, woman as president. And part of what does the song and the video is this calling to own sexuality, not only for women in general, but particularly women of color. And so we see that there was, or if you haven't seen, I encourage you to just on Twitter, search for WAP and see what some of the backlash has been about the song itself. There are mostly men of color who argue that the song WAP sheds a bad light for women of color, that it promotes promiscuity, and somehow other people, white male politicians, have also said that they've been disgusted by this display and song of WAP. But part of what's happening, because Senator Ocasio-Cortez talks about WAP in different ways on Twitter, and she says women against patriarchy, is that we get to this whole essentialist or monolithic womanhood that is supposed to exist. You are either the Meg Thee Stallion and Cardi B of the world, or you are Representative Ocasio-Cortez or Senator Kamala Harris. You can't be both. And I call BS to that. Because women, regardless of what role they play, should have the ability to own their sexuality, whether they're a senator, a representative, or a rapper. I can speak to you in this way just fine, but I should also have the ability to go into my car if I want to and blast WAP, which I do, and not be judged by it, not be judged by the racial stereotypes that are so historically embedded in our society that some people don't even realize they're perpetuating it. Peggy Noonan, for example, from the Wall Street Journal. And when we address violence, and when we address issues of women's ability to participate in political forums, we have to think about this intersectional erasure and invisibility. This idea, because we say that there is one type of woman, that there is an essential one type of Black woman, one type of Latinx women, that somehow they are not deserving of analyzing violence or police brutality. And instead of talking about how police brutality might then impact women of color, or how misogyny might impact women of color differently, there's a tendency to just erase them entirely. And so before we get to questions, I say, fuck the patriarchy. I said what I said. Cardi B gives this excellent quote. And so Cardi B, I didn't include her very much because I wanted to talk about Meg Thee Stallion's piece and what happened to her and the violence that occurred. But Cardi B has been known, even prior to becoming a well-known mainstream rapper, to talk about political issues. But because she uses certain language, her comments are either pushed to the side or considered to be ignorant, and yet she addresses some of the very main things that the academy or people in the ivory tower address. She's asking in this quote, what's happening to my tax dollars? And whether you use fuck, whether you say, can you explain to me, whether you say dismantle the patriarchy, regardless of the words you use, you should be heard. And so Mona Eltahawy talks about civility and how civility is not going to overturn patriarchy. How racism and sexism, when people talk about racism or sexism, or if people are racist and sexist, that those individuals are not civil. Representative Yoho was not civil when calling Representative Ocasio-Cortez a fucking bitch, right? And so with that, Mona Eltahawy and others have argued that this very issue of a language or what words are used is just another way to consolidate power. And so when you have Meg Thee Stallion and Cardi B using certain language in WAP to own their sexuality and to talk about their sexuality, rather than talk about the message itself, people are disturbed by the language that's used. And if they're so disturbed, that means language has power. And we know language has power. And so if Representative Yoho can say, you know, fucking bitch, if other people can use certain words, if you have a presidential candidate who is using certain words in campaigns, any of those things, then why is it so troubling for Cardi B or Meg Thee Stallion to use certain language within their music to address a point? And so with that, I'd love to get into a little bit more of discussion. I'll stop my screen now to see if there's any questions, but you're welcome to ask questions either through the chat function or the Q&A.
Thank you for that wonderful discussion. Yeah, so we'll just wait and see if anyone poses any questions here, and I will be reading them aloud. So feel free to use everyone the Q&A function, or the chat is also fine. Okay, so we do have a question. What can more people do to truly own who they are, either sexually or as themselves, in order to take down the patriarchy?
That is a great question. And so personally, I struggle with this. You know, I've argued that I am from the Bronx, and part of what the backlash that Senator Kamala Harris had when she was running for, when she was on the campaign and a presidential candidate, was people saying that she came across as unlikable because she was too much of a politician. And part of that, we're not looking at how people are raised when they're younger. So Senator Harris grew up in a time in which she had to code switch. She had to use certain language and behave in certain ways in order to have access to certain space, right? And so now in 2020, people are like, well, shift gears, just change your language. And that's easier said than done. And so now I think more and more people are realizing that in order for them to move forward or to own who they are, that they have to use their language from their core and who they are. In terms of patriarchy and taking it down, it's a step-by-step process, and it's I would argue it's not clean and quick. It's going to be rough, but part of it is addressing those people that would say, well, you know, Meg the Stallion and Cardi B are saying promiscuous things. Well, we are not saying the same thing about male rappers. When male rappers talk about having sex with multiple women, when certain rappers like Snoop Dogg and others tell Black women that they need to watch their mouths or watch what they say. Part of that resistance is fighting back. Part of that resistance is using the language that you want to. Part of that resistance is existing. And so existing and being in your own space is part of the way we fight patriarchy.
Thank you. We have another question. How would you relate these concepts to how Michelle Obama was treated by conservative voices during her tenure as First Lady?
That's a great question, because that is the perfect example of how even if you do everything that they want you to do, that you're still discriminated against, right? You wear your hair in a particular way, you speak in proper English, you do everything that you're told that you're supposed to do, and yet you still have these racist attacks. And so going with this question back to the other as well, it doesn't matter how you act or how you behave. That is a kind of a scapegoat in terms of patriarchy itself. Fighting patriarchy and addressing issues around how Michelle Obama was treated, the way she was talked about being an angry Black woman, the way she was labeled as being the one that really controlled things and not President Obama. All of that is manifested in historical stereotypes against Black women and women of color. This idea that they're dominant and they need to be submissive in some way and let a man lead. It's not only manifested in the Black community, of course, it's in mainstream community as well. But I think in the case of Michelle Obama, it was a huge reflection on racial stereotypes within the US. And if we're looking at Michelle Obama's wonderful ways in which she's addressing issues around race, the way she has come out later to talk about some of the things that she went through, I think is a great case to understand how Black womanhood is not monolithic, that the experiences of Michelle Obama are not the same as the experiences of Senator Kamala Harris, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or even Meg the Stallion, but how all of these women experience the same or similar racial stereotypes, all rooted in racism and sexism in the US.
Thank you. So another question is, can you discuss how folks engaged with Kamala Harris, her debate performance from a couple weeks ago? in relation to these topics?
Yes, that's a great question, and something that I wanted to bring up. If you go back and look at the debate, Senator Harris's facial expressions and her body language, many people have argued, especially women of color, have said that that's the very feeling that they have felt in almost every meeting. This idea of having to toe the line, of needing to address someone that's cutting them off, as well as not being seen as angry, the angry Black woman or the sassy Black woman. And part of the way Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, dealt with the situation, it was like a mind Olympics. And this is the ongoing chore women of color have to do on a regular basis, of having to balance, how do I address this issue while at the same time not having them see me as a stereotype. And even then, there were people who still complained about her performance. And so how we bring it all together in terms of the big D stands for big demeanor, which is a line Meg the Stallion uses in WAP, is owning the space and coming into the space and taking up that space in areas in which Black women are, or women of color are told that they shouldn't be taking up space. And so her performance in that debate, her facial expressions, I think really brought out her personality, in addition to showing us as a society how we continue to label Black women as sassy, or focus solely on their facial expressions, their neck movements, versus what they're actually saying in terms of policy.
Thank you for that. I actually have a question. I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because this has come up for me and some of my friends who we all identify as feminists. So many feminists don't like the word bitch, but it is used in hip hop and in popular culture. How do you feel about that word? Is that something we can take back, or is that just a negative that we should try to stay away from?
I think that's a personal decision, but I also think it does change things in context, right? If we get to the root of the word, it's a female dog. And so to call someone out their name, how I would colloquially say it if I was with people, can be both negative and positive. So I think in terms of hip hop, I think back to Queen Latifah and Unity, and I'm probably really aging myself based on probably who's watching. So Queen Latifah, rapper before actress, before gospel singer, sung Unity, and she talks about how she asks, who are you calling a bitch? And in that song and in that video, she's talking about how she's walking down the street, and if she is approached by someone and she doesn't like it and she says back off, that he then calls her a bitch. So in this whole song, she's talking about street harassment, something that women still experience on a day-to-day basis. But at that same time in that song, she's talking about, if we're playing, if you're one of my homegirls, if you're one of my homeboys, it's perfectly okay to call me that in a different context. So I know some feminists don't like it. I think we get into a bad situation when we tell women what they can or cannot say. We get into a gray area where you say that because you're a feminist, you're not allowed to use the word bitch. And so that gets us back to that essentialism that I was talking about, because what that then says is that there is some type of essentialist feminist. And if you use a certain word, if you behave in a certain way, that somehow you're knocked off the feminist pedestal. And so I would caution anyone who would say feminists shouldn't use the term. But if you say you shouldn't use the term, then you should have an idea as to why you feel that way. You should have an idea of the root of that word. And I think, to dig a little deeper, some of it's based on class, some of it's based on people's lived experiences. So if you've grown up in the Bronx, if you've grown up in a city and you have certain interactions, then yeah, certain language is your day-to-day language, but that doesn't make you any less intelligent. That doesn't make you any less of a feminist. That's the words that you use. That's in your lexicon, your vocabulary. And so class becomes a thing. And I'm not talking only social economic status, I'm talking about people's lived positions. Because I would say we probably won't hear Senator Kamala Harris saying, "What up, bitch?" On live TV, right? But you will have Meg the Stallion doing it. And it's a generational divide because you have Alexandria Representative Ocasio-Cortez saying, "Bitches get shit done," right? And so there's a generational divide, there's a class divide, but I would caution anyone who would say that feminists shouldn't use the term, because then we're getting into that essentialism again.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I encourage participants, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them up. Right now we have another one for you. Can you discuss the public reactions to AOC and the other women of color representatives generally?
Yes, I think in the last, the last presidential debate on Thursday, the current president said AOC +3, and there's been an ongoing conversation or ongoing piece around the Fab Four, as they're called. And part of AOC's, even though we're not friends, I like to think we're friends, AOC's reaction was, my friends call me AOC. You're not allowed to call me AOC. I believe it's because of the fear of losing power. You don't talk about something, you don't bring stuff up constantly if it's not in the forefront of your mind. So the fact that you have younger women of color entering the political field, and then in general, you have this idea that the number of people of color are going to outnumber white men and women. It's the fear of losing power that then results in backlash, that results in negative terminology being used. And so I think the reaction to Representative Ocasio-Cortez speaks volumes to what we've observed and experienced throughout history, this idea that younger women, especially younger women of color, have no place in certain rooms. And the fight that Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, Ariana Presley, and the other representatives is this idea of pushing back. And I just want to point out that pushback that women of color in Congress are currently doing, that's emotional labor as well. It's exhausting. And so we might be resisting in different ways. We might be promoting feminism and fighting misogyny and misogynoir on our fronts. But this is why I say kind of political violence. I'm not talking only about physical, but I'm talking about the language. I'm talking about the attempts to knock people for their experience. They're at the forefront of that. And so I think these reactions, the Twitter feeds, the Twitter notes, talking about these things on social media is another way of resistance. It's another way of fighting the good fight against patriarchy and racism.
Thank you for that response. So one thing I was thinking about is, and this happens with all kinds of communities, sometimes women of color themselves perpetuate, these kinds of criticisms of, WAP and other women of color. Can you speak to that a bit? Like, why does this happen? How can we maybe combat that?
I was saying, but I was still on mute. My apologies. Yeah. One of the things that I've been asked, especially about WAP, is, well, how do women of color expect to be respected when they portray themselves in a certain manner? And my answer to that is no one owns them but themselves. And so if a woman wants to own her sexuality by explicitly talking about it, about owning her body, owning her sexual pleasure, then that is for that woman. And if we're talking about feminism and getting at the root of feminism, feminism is an idea that we are fighting against oppression on multiple levels, not just gender, but based on sexual orientation, based on race, based on access to healthcare services. It's more than just gender. So to tell a woman that she should not speak in a certain way, that she should not behave in a certain way, further perpetuates the power structure that feminism is supposed to be deconstructing in the first place, right? And so if you look at the lyrics and you see what is being said and evaluate them, part of what people are not doing is just that. Because she says Big D stands for big demeanor. Why is she saying Big D? It's because usually in all the other rap songs with men, Big D stands for dick. And somehow women are supposed to desire a big D. And part of what Meg Thee Stallion is saying is no, Big D stands for big demeanor. I have a big personality. I'm gonna take up space. And some of that can be about sexuality, but others can be about my intellect and what I have to say. Because what we forget is that rappers are people. Meg Thee Stallion went to school. Cardi B has a voice. We forget those things. We forget them as human beings. Rather, we just say this is what they presented to us. Going further into that song itself, she talks about, well, when he asked, whose is it? You all have to go through the lyrics yourself. But when he says, whose is it? What she's talking about is usually in a heterosexual counter, when a guy is saying, well, whose vagina, whose body is this? Part of what Meg Thee Stallion is saying is, well, when I get on top, I'm gonna spell my name. And what she's saying is, it's mine. Like, we could be having sex, but I'm allowing you entry in here, but this is still mine. That's big. And so if we're talking about class and we're talking about access, not everyone has access to have these conversations like we're having today. Not everyone has access to deconstruct feminism in the way that we are and the way we're talking about it. And so how do we talk to the people who are living in the Bronx? How do we talk about people who are, talk to people who are living in the South Side to say, you should own your body. You should own your sexuality. You should own who you are. And I can't go to them and go, okay, let's go to deconstruct sexuality and feminism. No, people's entry point into feminism and into ownership of one's body comes at different ways. And so that's part of what we need to recognize. How do people have their feminism or feminist awakening? And it's not always going into politics. It's not always going to school. Sometimes it could be listening to WAP. Sometimes it could be listening to Cardi B.
Thank you. Those are really great points. Well, we have 4 minutes left. Let's see if we can maybe get one more question in. This is a good question. How do we make sure that trans and non-binary folks are included in these conversations about gender oppression?
This is particularly important, especially when we talk about violence, because when we talk about violence of Black and brown women, oftentimes we're not giving those statistics of Black and brown trans women that have been murdered based on transphobia, as well as racism and sexism. And so this inclusion, I think there are a number of ways to discuss this. And the person that I tend to love to use, especially if we're talking about hip hop, is Big Frida. And so Big Frida is a New Orleans bouncer and Frida's voice has been used in multiple songs. And so whenever the participants have the time and look into it, Beyonce has used Frida's voice. What's his face? Drake has used Frida's voice, but seldom do you see Frida in the videos. Seldom do you actually have Frida present. And that's because Frida was born male and presents and sometimes dresses as a woman. Frida is in a relationship with a man. And then on top of that, Frida is very much outspoken about the number of trans women of color that have been murdered and brutalized. So what's important to note is that there is a whole set of people who call themselves feminists, but would say that it's people who are born female. And again, based on what I said earlier, that is the antithesis of what feminism is supposed to be about. Because a lot of the violence that trans women experience is rooted in misogyny, it's rooted in sexism, it's rooted in racism, and of course it's rooted in transphobia and toxic masculinity, because often the perpetrators are men. And so it's rooted in misogyny and a failure to address that toxic masculinity at its core is not going to then, well, it fails to address the issue at hand. And so it's very important to not talk about gender in full binary terms, in terms of man, woman. And part of the reason why we're using pronouns now is to kind of deconstruct and get to the root of misogyny in the first place. And part of that is the toxicity of saying that if you were born male, you have to identify as a boy or a man. And if you were born female, you have to identify as a woman or girl.
Thanks again. So we're at 4 o'clock. So just wanted to give you the opportunity to say any last words if you'd like.
Again, thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed speaking to you all. What I do want you all to think about as we head into the upcoming election is just watch the ways that the media, whether it's TV or the news, how they talk about race, how they talk about gender. And it's not just right or left side. Both sides have a tendency, or all sides have a tendency to talk about Black women and brown women in very monolithic ways. The other piece is you can learn a lot from hip hop, whether you like the song or not. If you actually listen to the lyrics, or instead of just listening to the beat or watching the video, we can learn a lot from it. And again, WAP itself, broken down, is a blueprint of women of color's ownership of their sexuality, not only based on being free or wanting to have sex with whomever they choose, but also the sexual pleasure from that. And women for centuries, especially women of color, have been told to suppress their sexuality. So 2020 is clearly an interesting year for many different reasons. However, I think we're at a crucial point in history in recognizing our capacity to manage some of these issues, as well as our capacity to then address them.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really insightful and really interesting, and definitely some good advice there at the end. And thank you everyone who attended. We hope that you enjoyed the discussion and hope to see you again for our next equality.